Hi, I'm David Miller, and I'm here with the eighth in a series of mini-lectures on Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice. We're on Volume 3, and today we're going to be tracking Lizzie's change of heart toward Darcy. Last time, we saw how the conclusion of Volume 2 prepares for the first movement of Volume 3. Here is how Elizabeth's feelings and perceptions develop when she visits Darcy's estate at Pemberley. As we'll see, the change in Elizabeth's feelings toward Darcy is conveyed indirectly through the narrator's description of her perceptions. In effect, her visit is another scene of reading, one that progresses from her first view of the grounds into the house, then to her interview with the housekeeper, and finally her contemplation of Darcy's portrait in the upstairs gallery, which we talked about briefly last time. This progress takes a striking turn when Darcy appears in person, as if the portrait had come to life. In the exchange of visits that follows, it becomes apparent that he's undergone his own change of heart since they last met at the parsonage in Hunsford. Just as it looks like Darcy and Elizabeth may reach an understanding, the news arrives that Lydia has absconded with Mr. Wicked. And Elizabeth, mortified by the social disgrace of her worst nightmare come true, is convinced that now Darcy can never think of proposing to her. Once he appears unattainable, she is, naturally, convinced of how much she loves him. You remember what I said earlier in these lectures about perception and truth? Locke's principle, which states that our judgments appear to us in the form of perceptions, governs Elizabeth's reading of Pemberley. Viewing Darcy's estate for the first time, she sees Pemberley House standing well on rising ground, fronted by a stream of some natural importance that was swelled into a greater but without any artificial appearance. The language describing her impressions of the landscape could apply almost verbatim to the judgments she has unconsciously been forming about Darcy himself. These judgments bleed through in the way she sees his property. This means that Elizabeth's tour of the estate will serve as a revelation of the owner's character. In this way, the episode not only redeems Darcy, it also redeems property. All the vulgar talk we hear in this novel about so many thousand a year treats property in a purely mercenary spirit. Here, by contrast, we behold property as the outward expression of its owner's moral qualities. Property turns out to have its own eloquence, its own expressive style. As a result, Elizabeth reads the estate no less than she did the letter. This process of reading the estate is described just as carefully as that of reading the letter was in Volume 2, and it completes the reversal of Elizabeth's perspective on Darcy. We move from the grounds to the main rooms of the house to the upstairs, guided, once we arrive indoors, by the housekeeper, whose testimony adds to that of the property itself. She leads us from the miniatures downstairs to the full-length portrait of Darcy upstairs, and so to the moment in which Elizabeth's contemplation of his face crystallizes transformation in her judgment of his character. In this moment, Elizabeth is once again perceiving Darcy as a surrogate father, a figure of protection and authority. At this point, Elizabeth has completed her rereading of Darcy. You remember the passage I quoted earlier, the one describing his first appearance in Hertfordshire at the Meryton Ball? That's when it takes Darcy about half the evening to go from being much handsomer than Mr. Bingley to having a most forbidding, disagreeable countenance. That transformation, presented so satirically by the narrator at the beginning of Volume 1, is now finally reversed, and the original perception of Darcy's dignity and good looks is restored. Only now, the perception rests on a much firmer foundation than rumors of his income. As thoughts of Darcy's power and authority are passing through Elizabeth's mind and before her eyes, the narrator tells us that she stood before the canvas on which he was represented and fixed his eyes upon herself. Her fantasy is animating the portrait so vividly that it seems to look back at her. A few sentences later, Darcy appears before her, almost as if he had stepped out of the frame in the portrait upstairs in response to her unconscious wishes. In fantasy, she had been revising her former impression of him, remembering the warmth of his regard while softening its impropriety of expression. Now he appears before her in person to confirm the change, treating her and her inferior connections with a degree of courtesy and humility she can hardly believe. Just when it looks as if a happy ending may be in sight, Lydia elopes with Wickham to create what I refer to in the outline for today as the bar. The bar is what separates lovers, like the family feud in Romeo and Juliet. In traditional stories of romantic love, Lancelot and Guinevere, Tristan and Isolde, Abelard and Eloise, and of course Shakespeare's young lovers, the bar is what makes the love hopeless, and therefore, of course, all the more romantic. It seems perverse that the same bar which makes love hopeless in these stories also provokes and strengthens it. Nothing makes us want something more than knowing we can't have it. And so it's one of the familiar paradoxes of the romantic tradition that in order to sustain the high pitch of transcendent passion, romantic love has to be unfulfilled. The bar is not only an obstacle to such love, it's also a prop. It's the thing that holds it up. In this story, the bar is shame. It was the inappropriate behavior of Lydia and the rest of the Bennet family that drove Darcy and Bingley away at the end of Volume 1. Now that shame is magnified by the scandal of Lydia's elopement. Just when Darcy seems, by his newly courteous behavior, to have cleared the bar, Lydia raises it, and predictably, Elizabeth finds that she had never so honestly felt that she could have loved him as now, when all love must be in vain. Romeo and Juliet often provokes the question how the lovers can fall for each other so quickly. Clearly Jane Austen would agree this isn't the way it should be done. Her narrator sizes up Elizabeth's change of heart toward Darcy. Its slow progress and its basis in gratitude and admiration are weighed against the romantic convention of love at first sight, which Austen refers to dryly as regard described as arising on a first interview with its object. Lizzie's bad experience with Wickham, says the narrator, might perhaps authorize her to seek the other, less interesting mode of attachment. But we don't want it to be too much less interesting, right? We don't want love to fade into nothing but gratitude and admiration. So we need the bar, which comes back into the story now to bring a touch of the old romantic intensity and perversity to the otherwise all too sedate and rational affections of Miss Bennet and Mr. Darcy. From this perspective, we can say that Lydia comes through just in the nick of time. And so the bar returns with a vengeance in the second movement of Volume 3. Once Lydia has married Wickham, Elizabeth considers it out of the question that Darcy would connect himself to the man he so justly scorned. Now she regrets her missed chance, convinced that she could have loved Darcy, humiliated to think what a triumph it would be for him to know how she feels, certain that they would have been the perfect couple, if only. This is the value of Lydia's elopement for the main story of the novel. By raising the bar, it not only prevents too quick a happy ending, prolonging the suspense with a more serious obstacle than ever, it also brings into the story an element of passion and perversity that link it to the great romances of the past. This sense of passion lends weight to the change in Elizabeth's character. Seeing how wrong she has been puts her through a humiliation just as severe as the one her rejection caused for Darcy. But hers is more real, for although we hear about his sense of shame and his change of heart, this only happens after the fact. We don't actually see the change happening from within his point of view. Instead, we stay close to Elizabeth's mind. It's by giving us such a careful account of her change of heart, I think, that Austen can afford to simply produce Darcy's like a rabbit out of a hat. Next time, We'll start with the transition to the third movement of Volume 3, where we find Elizabeth humbled even further by something she learns from Mrs. Gardner.